So please welcome again Mr. Julian Stubbs.
Well, good afternoon. I'm here to wake everybody up after lunch. Everybody has a big lunch. And I'm going to talk for the next 30 minutes about place branding and some of the issues in place branding. I've been involved with the branding of Stockholm. Why hasn't Stockholm got a great song? All these other cities have great songs. We need a great song for Stockholm. I've written this book called Wish You Were Here, all about place branding and specifically the work we did with the branding of Stockholm. I work for this organisation called UP. And I've worked with some nice brands, Nobel Peace Prize and Technicolor, but I'm going to focus on the place brands I've worked with this afternoon and talk a little bit about that. Now, to make it interesting, because it could be very boring, this subject, I thought what we talk about is something slightly different. So we'll talk about, what's it called in Swedish? Pangy-bugget? Yeah. Faulty Towers. We're going to talk about dead communist dictators and the greatest football team on earth, Liverpool Football Club.
Second greatest.
No, greatest. Anyway, what we're going to do, we're going to touch on those topics as we go through the next 30 minutes presentation. And I'm going to talk a bit about some of the really difficult issues when it comes to place branding. And I can tell you, of all the things I get involved with branding and marketing, places are the most difficult. And there's some really good reasons why it's so difficult. We're going to touch on some of those. Then I'm going to touch a little bit on positioning. So how do you position a place? What's that all about? You know about it with consumer goods, but can you position a city? And then during the course of that, we'll touch on these cases: Stockholm, Sigtuna, Stockholm Arlanda Airport, New York, Liverpool, Barcelona, maybe some more. So that's the agenda. We come to really, I think, the starting point for destination branding, and you have to ask yourself, who owns the destination? Who owns it? And this brings me to this topic that Coke, McDonald's, Burger King, Absolute Vodka, they're all made to be sold. And the people who own the brands are in a relatively strong position. They can decide to do what the hell they like with the brand. So it's relatively straightforward. With places, it's a bit more difficult. Because unless you happen to be a dictator, what you've got to recognise is no one person can decide about the branding of a city, a destination, a country. And that brings us into this whole area of thinking about stakeholders and stakeholder involvement. So, if I say Liverpool, what do you think of? Of course, football. There's one great football team in Liverpool. The Beatles, of course. And so you think about these iconic brands that Liverpool has, the football club, the Beatles. Part of their strategy, again, involved winning European Capital of Culture in 2008. A fantastic job they did of it. Got to go to Liverpool at night and see the architectural lighting project. Really spectacular if you go along the Mersey. They've really lit it up beautifully. And equally, apart from just investing money in new complexes, this is Matthew Street. This is Matthew Street in 1962 or 3 with the Beatles. This Matthew Street today. They've renovated it and brought it back to life and turned it into another living part of the city. So fantastic what you can even do with older parts of the city. But really impressive what they're doing in Liverpool. So that first message is really all about this. It's partnership, shared vision, and involvement of stakeholders is absolutely critical. That's a big process. It's a difficult process and takes time. So once you've gone through that and you've identified your stakeholders and maybe you know where you're headed, you've got to think about this thing called positioning. So what's that all about? Well, positioning, quite simply, is what goes on in our minds. It's the first thing we think about when a brand or a word or a place or a city is mentioned. We all constantly position things. Say Stockholm, people think something. Copenhagen, people think something. So they have positions. And the question is it the right position? And is it a position you need to develop? Because it's not saying the right things. And it's about destinations finding their own particular position and doing something fresh and authentic and standing for something. So with Sigtuna, what we did when we got involved, we kind of took as a starting point the heritage, Sweden's first town. We took that kind of as our brief, and then we simplified it. And we said, well, forget that, we'll just talk about Sigtuna first. It was the first place. The guy who built this place was an entrepreneur. He took a risk. He was doing something new. So shouldn't we get back to doing that again and not be locked into the fact that we don't want anything to change? We've got to be dynamic and grow the community. That resulted in a new identity that looks like that, with the one symbol representing the first. Sigtuna, where Sweden begins. And so again, it's looking for something you can make your own and make it authentic. And some of the advertising we've done, and the brand book, and again it came down to this thing about local community, local government, local business working together with a shared vision. It was really important. So even smaller communes and communities can find this approach. So Stockholm, let's think a little bit about that. And so when I first moved to Stockholm, somebody said to me that Stockholm was the Venice of the North. Now what that made me think of immediately was it's going to be bloody difficult to get the gondola out there by Stadshuset. Venice of the North, that means we're a second-rate Venice. Okay? If I want to go to real Venice, I'll go to Venice. But we're a second-rate Venice. And the problem got worse because I'd heard the same thing said about Bruges and Amsterdam and St. Petersburg. They were all saying they were Venice of the North. So we were competing for being a second-rate Venice, which isn't great. And then you look at some of the other things we were saying at the same time. And we were talking about beauty on water, gateway to Sweden, heart of the Baltic. And all that does is it leads to confusion. People don't know what you stand for. You're standing for too many things. You've got to be more focused. The first thing we did was start to look at a business proposition. We said, okay, well, what's Stockholm really got going for it? And we looked at the numbers. We said, well, actually, we think this is the most important place in Scandinavia for business and for tourism. It's the #1 destination. And we ticked that off. We said, yeah, we could be that, looking at what we've got. How do we then turn that into a creative proposition that people get in an instant? Say, you invent the country, because Scandinavia is not the country. You say, Stockholm, the capital of Scandinavia. Final thought, and it's a great expression in English. Rome wasn't built in a day, and the fact is it takes time to do these things. They don't happen overnight. Stockholm we've been working with for eight years or more, so it does take time. Jon.
Thank you very much.